Russia has attacked Ukraine with 495 missiles and drones alto together. One of the, most devastating attacks so far, in my opinion. What is happening? Well, it's a war of attrition. And let's just make an observation. Yeah, they launched 495 rockets, missiles, drones, and it caused damage, but it did not cause Ukraine to collapse. So let's flip it. If Ukraine had done something similar to Russia, the West be going, oh man, Russia, boy, they're on their last legs. They're going to die. They're going to collapse any minute now. So, it just illustrates Russia is in a steady campaign of attrition, and they are destroying the ability of power to operate in cities. This is where the narrative completely breaks down. If Ukraine launched 495 missiles into Russia, Western media would declare Moscow finished by morning. Headlines would scream collapse. Analysts would talk about regime failure. But when Russia does it, suddenly the standard changes. Now, it's not decisive enough. That tells you this isn't analysis. It's expectation management. The Russian strategy, frankly, to compel the citizens to get out of these cities so that they'll be able to attack more freely. I have heard from a couple of our Russian soldiers that they felt that in the past their hands were tied because of orders from the top to limit damage on civilian areas. So that, and they weren't saying, that they didn't care about kill, they wanted to kill civilians. They're just pointing out that the rules of engagement that Russia has operated under limit to them. So, this is just of the 490 drone and missiles. Rockets, though, that's like half of what Russia was doing, say, a month ago. So they're just, they've got an ability to sustain this kind of operation, and in Ukraine doesn't have any air defense system left to counter it. What he's describing isn't panic or loss of control. It's constraint being removed. Russian forces were operating under strict rules that limited damage. In cities, those limits now appear to be easing, and the key detail is scale. This level of strikes is actually lower than before. That suggests capacity and sustainability, not desperation. One of the things, I've said repeatedly, this is all about the money. BlackRock could put a huge bet that it was going to reap enormous profits out of a Ukraine. You really would think that a guy like Larry Fink, who's a billionaire, that they would actually sit down and have done some real solid PL, got solid intelligence, done planning, made sure that they had the right information. Nope. They bought the Melbo bovine excrement stories that were being put out. That's true. So it's sort of ironic to see this, but that's not the first time I've seen a billionaire on Wall Street do some stupid stuff, and just because you think they're smart. I saw that with Bill Amana, in a particular with his herbal life. Short. He didn't. That gets us off on a side note. But there's another billionaire who made some assumptions about a company and didn't do the actual research to know what he was dealing with. Well, in this case, Larry Fink didn't do the research, to recognize that the Russian army was quite powerful and was going to defeat Ukraine. This wasn't strategy. It was a financial bet. Big money assumed the narrative was true and skipped the hard intelligence. We've seen this before. Confidence, replacing due diligence. When profit leads and reality follows, the outcome is usually the same. Russia is not going to withdraw from until there is it might consider withdrawing from Kharkiv and Sumy. If Ukraine immediately withdraws its troops out of Zaporizhia and in debts they're no longer in, the Hansk, the Russians have retaken all of that, but they're not going to do, Ukraine has insisted they're not going to do that. Okay, so Russia is going to keep pressing forward. They really are on the threshold of cutting across Zaporizhia. Very moving, very, very rapidly in the coming weeks. So, Ukraine is a dying nation, and it's, pretending that it's still alive, but it's dying. What he's laying out isn't ideology. It's leverage. Russia isn't talking about withdrawal because it doesn't need to. Ukraine has no incentive to concede. and Russia has no pressure to stop. When one side can keep advancing and the other can only insist the outcome stops being political, it becomes structural. Right now what we're seeing is there is no European point of view. There's a split. You at least have three, albeit some of the smaller countries. You got Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. There you know they want no part of this going to war with Russia. They'd like to have normalized relations with Russia. Economic ties with Russia. It's the Mertzum Kronon and Starmer other the UK, France, and Germany that are the biggest instigators and agitators. And then on the EU side, you've got the van der Leyen you. No, I prefer fond of lying, and a Kayakalis. So, they talk a big game. No, they talk in a very belligerent fashion. But what can they do? I mean, they have no military power of any consequence. They've got some numbers on paper, but in terms of actual ability and solid commanders that can deploy to the field and martial art, they don't have that. But they definitely continue to try to provoke a war with Russia. That seems to be their only play right now. And so Russia's become, either I think the Putin and Lvov and the rest of his national security team, they're completely fed up. They've lost all patience with the Europeans. They see them as just this yappy little chihuahua, vicious, can will try to bite you. But when all is said and done, they're more of a nuisance than an immediate military threat. This isn't sought a unified Europe. It sought a split one. Some states want normalization and trade. Others push confrontation without the military capacity to back it up. When rhetoric runs ahead of power, escalation stops being strategy and becomes risk. But look, Europe's committing suicide. Instead of importing inexpensive oil and gas from Russia, they're going to go for alternative sources, which is going to significantly increase the price of that fuel. And what that translates into is a less economic growth and probably INFL helping spark inflation. So you get the worst of both worlds. You lagging economy and surging prices in their end. They're doing this knowingly. And just so they think that they can hurt Russia. Yeah, we're not going to buy your product anymore. And Russia says, okay, great, we'll sell it elsewhere. This is the core contradiction. Europe cuts itself off from cheap energy to punish Russia, but Russia simply sells elsewhere. The cost stays in Europe. Higher prices, weaker growth, rising inflation. That's not pressure. That's self-inflicted damage. Most of Europe didn't want to have anything to do with Russia. Basically, this arrogance. Oh, they're just a bunch of sloves. No, they're not as intelligent and refined as cultured as us. And actually, part of this goes back to the religious split between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. They're both Christians, but, they're fighting and split over the interpretation of, the Holy Spirit. So, for 300 years, Russia, tried to, if you will, ingratiate itself and was constantly rejected. And so Caragano says, no, our futures to the east, our futures with China, our future. Building up Siberia, Russia is a vast territory with almost incalculable natural resources and a forging ties with China with India, that are more likely to be, let's call it collaborative efforts. This didn't begin recently. It's a long civilizational split. After decades of rejection by the West, Russia pivoted east toward China and India. That shift wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. There is no rational thought being applied to the foreign policy in Europe. It is its ground, it's all emotion, hatred of Russia. And part of that hatred is grounded in Russia's approach for, let's call it, traditional values. Europe's become a veritable freak show in terms of its ideological embrace. Because Germany is suffering the way that no other countries is. Suffering right now, I don't. No, if you saw the Financial Times reporting that the Volkswagen is closing a plant in Germany, for the first time in 8 years. Yeah, they survived world. They survived World War II, but couldn't survive Merz, and Olaf Schultz. These are huge impacts, when you look at society like the economy of Germany. How is that going to help? Merz, I don't know but it's not doesn't translate into any immediate financial pain for the average German because of their system, their social, their security net. That's out there. Are people still they start drawing money off the government and they'll still take vacations. But in the process now Germany is having to borrow more and more money. So the debt, the foreign obligations of Germany is increasing and increasing rapidly. And so one of these days they're going to be back to the days of the Weimar Republic when they had hyperinflation and you know that the economy was collapsing. It is the trajectory that Germany is on is not good. Because there's not just Volkswagen that closed. They're losing a number of industries, and some are packing up and moving overseas, so that the Germany once really had become a miracle in the aftermath of World War II had rebuilt and was the industrial power of Europe. No longer. The argument here is that emotion has replaced strategy. Germany's choices are being insulated in the short term by welfare systems, but the long-term cost is debt, deindustrialization, and decline. When factories like Volkswagen start shutting down, the problem isn't ideology, it's economics. History shows this path doesn't end gently. Europe, they're talking about that Ukraine would join EU by 2027. And looking at Europe today, let's assume they all agree on, Ukraine joining EU. But is the situation in the EU prepared for that? Ukraine going to be worse than any nightmare they had so far. Yeah, they're bringing in a dysfunctional economy, a nation that's in ruins, population is headed towards extinction. They don't have a birth rate that can replace the population. And the number of dead that have been inflicted upon the military by the Russians, and coupled with the number that have fled overseas. We've talked about this before. From what Ukraine's population was, say, 15 years ago, it's now been cut more than half. It's down to, it was like at 43 million now. It's down around 19 million. That's not sustainable. And so Europe wants to bring them into the EU. I could see Russia in a way saying, okay, go ahead. Yeah, you can have them. It'd be one thing if you're bringing in, you say, hey, we've got a club and we want to bring in, Rich. He's a great athlete, man. And, he's got the well-educated. Bring him in. No, they're bringing in the country. That's the guy. That's, poor. He's a drug addict. He has no money. He's got bad health. He's got liver cancer. That's who you're going to bring into your club. Because then the past Europeans like Larry Fink, who we talked about earlier, with BlackRock, they're counting on controlling the Ukraine was one of the top 5 countries in the world in terms of the natural resources. So they were, had a significant potential for of wealth, which is what everybody was no salivating after anyway. But as Russia's offensive continues, it's controlling more and more of what used to be Ukrainian resources. This exposes the contradiction at the heart of the plan. The EU is talking about expansion while struggling with stagnation at home, absorbing a war-damaged economy with a collapsing population isn't immigration. It's liability transfer. And the longer the war continues, the less of Ukraine there is left to integrate.